So picking up where we left off, I now want to show you how to deploy an application using the web UI. Coming to our front page, I'm going to click on Auth Provider. Since I'm using centralized authentication, it's going to ask me to authenticate and boot me in. And now I have my web interface, and if I go to my applications, I can see the astrocyte that I deployed in the previous example. Now, before I deploy another app, I actually want to show you our services. If I go to Services and Catalog on the side, you can see the list of the available services. Some of them are coming soon. Others are ready to go, like an APM, an Application Performance Monitoring, Grafana for graphs, MongoDB, MySQL, Postgres, Redis, RabbitMQ. I'm actually going to deploy a Postgres database server. So clicking on Postgres, it's going to show me I actually already have a database deployed. I'm going to deploy a second one. So come to the corner, go create. I'm going to call this MS-Docs DB2. And over here, you can see that it has a section for binding to applications. Now, when you deploy a service, in order for your app to make use of it, you need to bind the service to the app. The act of binding does a few things. If you go to our documentation, which is available at docs.sidepro.cloud, and on the side you navigate to Platform Services and Postgres, for example, you can see there are a bunch of environment variables that will get exported to your application when you bind the service to the app. And in this case, Postgres has several environment variables, including PSQL hostname, username, password, or everything combined in a single database URL environment variable. This is so you don't have to worry about credentials. As long as you consume the environment variables, everything will work. So I'm not going to bind to an application just yet because I haven't created it. So I'm going to click Create in the corner, and within a few seconds, it should deploy the application. You can see there's no additional settings because everything is already handled for you as a managed service. And now it's beginning to deploy. So I'm going to now deploy an application which is going to be bound to this database. So if I go to Applications and I go Create, in the previous example in the video series, I showed an example of deploying through a folder type source. So that was a local folder that I told SidePro to deploy from. But there's several other types of application sources that can be used, including archives like a zip or a tar file. You can also deploy public Docker container images if you want to bypass the entire build pack process and just deploy a Docker container. That is also available. And there's also directly from Git, which is a nice feature. If I come to my browser window, I actually already have an application I want to deploy. This is actually an example from Azure that we modified. If I grab the repo URL and paste it here and tell it I want to deploy from the main branch and click Next, you can see there's advanced settings, but I don't need to worry about those. All the defaults are sane. I'm going to name this app MS-Docs. I can adjust other settings if needed, like the number of instances. You can see there's a section for routes. This is if you want to add custom DNS, and there's directions on how to do that in our documentation. But it's not necessary. If you leave it blank, it will auto-generate a URL, just like the previous example did. I can set some other advanced settings like enabling scaling to 0, auto-scaling, CPU and memory settings if I want to tweak them. But honestly, I don't need to touch them because the defaults are all sane. What I do need to do is set some environment variables. So if I come and I click read from a file, I actually already have an env.txt file, which is just a bunch of key value pairs. Clicking open will parse the file for me. And here you can see it is a mapping of names to the values. And as I showed you in the documentation, the Postgres service sets a bunch of environment variables for you, such as PSQL, DB name, host name, etc. But the app expects them in a different format, namely DB name, DB host, etc. So what this is doing is just a one-to-one mapping of what the application expects to what the environment provides. I'm going to click Next. And here is where I can bind to any available services. So this is DB2. This is the one that I showed you how to deploy. I have this original one that was there from the beginning. And the reason for this is if you're familiar with any ORM applications, most of them require running some migrations to pre-populate the database with tables and some data. I already did that to skip some steps, so I'm going to bind it to that database service. And I'm going to click Create, and very shortly, it should start streaming the build logs, very similar to how it did in the previous video on the command line. So here we go, the logs are starting to stream, and it should detect that this is a Python application because this is a Flask app, which is developed in Python. So it detected it's Python. It is setting the Python version to 3.12, although you can specify a different version if needed. And it's installing all the dependencies using pip, just like you would in a local environment. And hopefully it should detect that, there you go, that it is it's an app that needs Postgres. So it's installing the PsychoPG2 Postgres library. And it's also setting the environment, go back here, it's also setting a proc file. So if you're familiar with Heroku, they popularized this concept of using proc files. Now, the idea behind it is most of the time the build packs can figure out how to start your application. But if you have a custom way to start your app, you just create a file in the root called procfile with a capital P and specify, the web process as Flask run in this case with some flags to be passed to it in order to start. And if it's present, the system is going to start up the application using this command. So you can see that it successfully deployed. It went and exported the layers like it did in the previous example. And here are the app logs. This is the running application logs showing that the app has started. So if I close this and click on Done and click on the URL from the website, there we go. The application is now deployed, and this data is being pulled from the Postgres database that was bound to it. So another example of going from code to URL in a single push. I don't have to worry about things like Docker files, Docker containers, infrastructure, or anything like that. I literally just focus on the code and run a single command, and the app is deployed online, ready to go using best practices. I hope you enjoyed watching this video series. I will be releasing additional videos showing you some of the other services from our catalog, such as graphs and maybe the APM as well, to show you some of the capabilities of the cloud and how they're all integrated together. Thanks for watching.